Hi, this is Mike Oxendon. I really wanted to take a minute to recommend the book about Grant by Chernow. I listened to it on Audible. The narrator used different voices for the different characters. You can hear Mark Twain, and you can hear Robert E. Lee, and he uses different voices for all the different people, for President Lincoln, even for his wife Julia, and so the narrator did a great job. Chernow seems to look at things from a balanced perspective, where you can tell he's not going to believe every wild story about Grant's drinking, but he also isn't going to dismiss it like it doesn't exist, and just really captivating book. I like the geography of it, how Grant touches so much of our country, and the Civil War touches so much of our country, that listening to this book, there's so many connections going through Cincinnati and Southern Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, and then his tomb is in New York City, and there's just so much geography that brings it back in together. So I just have 3 points of things that I think that I need to learn from Grant and Grant's life. First is that he got back up. He got back up. So Grant was kind of given the opportunity to go to West Point. And as a side note, what's interesting, you know what Ulysses S. Grant, you know what the S in Ulysses S. Grant stands for? Well, he didn't. It wasn't actually his name. His name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. And a politician put his name wrong when they put him in for West Point, and then they started making fun of U.S. Grant when he got there, and the name stuck. And so he was actually, according to the author, again, this is something that Grant wouldn't have made known if it was the truth of what happened. But according to Chernow, he got put out of the army because of drinking. And he was on the West Coast. He had to spend like 4 years away from his family. And he's on the West Coast, and he gets put out of the army. And so he has a difficult time getting back home. So he is terrible at business. I think God created Grant with very specific skills, and he had lost all his money. He's in California, so he finally gets away to get back to the East Coast, because during that time you don't go through the center of the country. You go down and you cross over Central America at the Isthmus, and then you come back up. And so now he's in New York, and he's stuck. And so literally a man helps him, sees he's in trouble, helps him get back home. And that man was in Fort Donelson when the 2 other officers left and took 5,000 men with him. Grant captured Fort Donelson, one of his early victories, his second fort, but the first fort was really done by the Navy and was pretty simple. And he takes that fort, and he captures that man who had helped him. And the interesting thing is that all the officers know each other that are fighting in the Civil War. Most of them fought together in Mexico. And so he gets back up. At Shiloh, the first day of battle, they call it a Confederate victory. And so the next day, he decides that if they're tired and exhausted, then the enemy is tired and exhausted. And so he pushes the attack on the second day faster than the Confederates can get up and get moving. And he saw that as a way to victory, that if you suffer a defeat, if you get back up before they're expecting it, you can turn a defeat into a victory. And so that seems to have been what happened many times. He would lose the first battle, and then he would keep pressing and make a difference. And so he gets back up. He gets back up. He was willing to pay the price in blood for victory. When he crossed over the Rappahannock to get to Richmond, now he's in the Eastern Theater, and he has the Army of the Potomac. And when he crosses over, he goes and he loses a lot of men in the wilderness. And they say this is a place that Lee has won before, and Lee wins a victory there. And as they're celebrating and they're excited, Lee tells them, but the problem is Grant won't leave. He won't leave, and so he doesn't quit. Second, he knew the enemy. He knew Buckner, the guy he captured at Fort Donelson, said, if I had been in charge, you would not have walked right up to the fort and put us into a siege. I would have fought you as you were on your way up to the fort, and you wouldn't have gotten here. And he said, yeah, I know. but you weren't in charge. And if you had been in charge, I wouldn't have done it that way. And so he knew who he was fighting against. He knew his officers, and he would play on their pride or whatever opportunity he could find. Second, he had a team. He didn't work alone. He brought his family to the front. Some didn't think that was a wise thing, and he had a son get injured. It was too early to fight, too young to fight, and but Julia would come to the front lines and be with him, and I think that Abraham Lincoln saw him as somebody that he could trust. He was from the West, as it was considered at that time, and he was more of a frontiersman, and so he worked with Lincoln, and Lincoln worked with him. And when they came to Lincoln and they said, "Oh, he's a drunkard and he's gotten too many men killed, he needs to go," and Lincoln said, "But he fights." And then part of the team, Chernow sees Reynolds, his chief of staff, his main job as being keeping the alcohol away from Grant, and he stays with Reynolds through the whole war, and uses Reynolds even as president after the war. And so he had a team. He didn't fight alone, and so that was part of his strength, is that he had a team. And so he gets back up, he knows the enemy, and he has a team. I really recommend this book. Really enjoyed it. I found myself yearning for Appomattox Courthouse to come, and seeing the struggle that was happening in our country. Can you imagine your father-in-law being a zealous Democrat slave owner, and your father being a zealous Republican, probably considered a radical Republican, abolitionist, and going into battle and killing your wife's brothers in battle? That was the struggle that was happening in our country. Abraham Lincoln's wife came from a slave owning family as well, and so our country was so divided, and you can just see so much of our present day world was set up and determined by the things that happened here. And I really enjoyed the book. Grant was considered the protector of the black race by Frederick Douglass, and he put into action what Lincoln was talking about doing. And so again, I recommend the book. Really enjoyed it. There's so much more to it. If you've got questions, please post them below. I would love to talk about Grant and Chernow's book.